All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Future of Our Oceans webinar series brought to you by Oceans at Duke. I'm John Verdon at Duke's Nicholas Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Oceans at Duke is an interdisciplinary network of faculty and scholars at Duke working across the campus on issues of ocean sustainability. This community of scholars is really working to apply cutting edge insights from ocean science, governance, and business to tackle the ocean's most urgent and pressing challenges and opportunities for today. In this monthly webinar series, we're exploring a range of topics on the future of our oceans, from the future of marine conservation areas, the role of oceans in human health, the drivers and risks of deep seabed mining, the evolution of the blue economy, and then, of course, today's topic on oceanic plastic pollution. We're trying to highlight the latest work of Duke researchers while also engaging other experts and stakeholders who are connected to these challenges and addressing them in real time in today's world and in our oceans. Our goal is really to inform, inspire, and enable you to help ocean ecosystems and communities to flourish for the long term. So just to provide a few guidelines for our sessions today, the session will be 60 minutes, including our speaker's presentation and a Q&A in the last 10 minutes. Your cameras and microphones are not functional for the session, but we encourage you to share your questions and comments in the Q&A, which is monitored by our team. We also encourage you to go to the Oceans at Duke website, linked to your registration, to see any additional articles and resources related to our topics, to see details on the latest faculty research, and descriptions of future webinar sessions. Today's session will also be recorded and posted to the website later this week. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and first speaker today, Dr. Megan Dunphy-Daly. Dr. Dunphy-Daly is an instructor at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment, where she heads the Marine Lab Scholars Program for undergraduates and leads the university's plastic pollution working group of researchers who are collaborating across disciplines to address plastic pollution. She's also helping to lead a course on developing curriculum for youth to take action to address plastic pollution. And she recently co-published a paper on emerging technology solutions to the problem. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Dr. Dunphy-Daly to kick off our conversation.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome everybody. We're delighted to be here today to talk to you about this really pressing issue of plastic pollution. And we have a panel of 3 experts to talk with us about what's being done and potential solutions to this problem. So we'll proceed in 3 parts today. Our first expert, Zoe Diana from the Duke University Marine Lab, will talk to us about what governments around the world and large companies are doing to deal with plastic pollution. Our second expert, Michelle Nolan from Duke Law, will tell us about what local governments can do to deal with the plastic problem. And our third expert, Sarah Balch from the Pew Charitable Trusts, will tell us about pathways to stop marine plastic pollution and give us some promising bright spots of solutions. But before I turn it over to our first panelist, I wanted to introduce the problem of plastic pollution and set the stage. So we know that plastics are everywhere. They're versatile, they're cheap, they're convenient. They're used in everything from packaging to the automotive industry. However, due to plastic's longevity and resistance to decomposition, their widespread use has led to an epidemic of mismanaged waste. And the overwhelming majority of our plastic ends up in our landfills and natural environments, or is incinerated to become carbon pollution in our air. And as a result, plastic pollution is a pervasive and growing problem. So how did we get here? Plastics have become increasingly dominant in the consumer marketplace since their commercial development in the 1930s and 1940s. So this graph is showing time trends in total plastics production in million metric tons worldwide. So here, phase 1 highlights this slow development and the invention of most plastics commonly used today. Phase 2 is marked by rapid global expansion and exponential growth. And then phase 3 shows more linear growth that's similar to global economic growth. And by 2015, the annual plastic production had approached the combined weight of the human population. And today, it's very striking that we have twice as much plastic as we do animal dry weight biomass. And human-made mass exceeds all living biomass. And the plastic waste problem, where we have the uncontrolled release of plastic waste into the environment resulting from ineffective management, is especially prevalent in developed countries, where there's been this sharp rise in single-use plastic consumption and an expanding throwaway culture. Although, of course, all of this plastic doesn't end up in our backyard or in our waters. And more often, it's exported from developed countries to developing countries or whisked away by ocean currents. So around 150 million tons of plastic are already in our oceans. And this plastic waste is entering the ocean at a rate of around 11 million metric tons a year, where we find it on coastlines, in sea ice, at the sea surface, and on the sea floor. And we know that just like the plastic production graph that I showed at the start, plastic debris is increasing in our oceans. In fact, one report predicts that plastic pollution in the sea is likely to triple over the next decade. And we have this growing body of evidence that points to a broad range of detrimental effects of plastic pollution. So nearly 800 marine species are known to have been entangled in plastic or have ingested it. And ingestion can lead to blockages in the digestive tract, and it can also prevent marine animals from eating actual food. And as a result of ingestion by marine species, plastic has also entered the ocean food chain, exposing marine life to toxic chemicals that can end up in the food on our plates. So plastic pollution really is also a human health crisis. On average, we each consume a credit card sized amount of microplastics every week. So let that sink in. And these microplastics carry additives from the manufacturing process, chemicals adsorbed to the plastics, and pathogens or parasites that may be on the plastics. And just as a reminder, more than 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels, and plastic production is expected to more than double over the next 3 decades. So this is adding to the climate change problem because plastic production, collection, and disposal are major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So plastic is poisoning our bodies, from the air we breathe, to the water that we drink, to the food that we eat. But we are not without hope. So a variety of solutions to the plastic pollution problem have been proposed at local and national levels. So we'll get to hear about those today from Duke's experts, Zoe Diana and Michelle Nolan. And Pew's Unprecedented Marine Plastics Report shows that we can reduce 80% of the annual flow of plastic into the ocean in the next 20 years if we take the right steps, which Pew's expert, Sarah Balch, will talk to us about today. And here at Duke, we've convened our Plastic Pollution Working Group, which is an interdisciplinary group of faculty, staff, and students working together to study plastic pollution. This group was co-founded with John Verdon and Amy Pickle of the Nicholas Institute, Jason Samarelli of the Duke School of Medicine, myself, and then 2 of our panelists today, Zoe Diana and Michelle Nolan. So now I'd like to introduce our first expert panelist, Zoe Diana. Zoe is a PhD candidate in Duke's Marine Science and Conservation Department, as well as the Environmental Health and Toxicology program. She works in Dr. Dan Richoff's lab at the Duke University Marine Laboratory, and her research interests involve understanding how governments, businesses, and biologists approach plastic pollution mitigation.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Oceans at Duke, as well, for having me here today. So first off, I'm going to be discussing government and business responses to plastic pollution today, beginning with governments. I'm here representing a larger team at Duke and the Nicholas Institute, who completed the 20 years of government responses to plastic pollution report, which was funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts. We set out to answer the 2 questions that you see on the screen today: how have governments around the world responded to global plastic pollution, and what do we know about what has worked and what didn't work? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the answers to those questions today, though the full results are in the report that you see on the screen, as well as our plastics policy inventory, which I'll discuss soon. So why do this? This report serves as a basis for increased monitoring of progress towards UNEA Resolution 4.6, Marine Plastic Litter and Microplastics, which requested a stocktaking of existing activities and action by governments, as well as the private sector, which we'll cover later in my presentation, to reduce marine plastic litter and microplastics. Another goal of this study was to inform future policies adopted to reduce plastic pollution. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background first before I dive into the map that you're seeing on the screen here. The scope of our study included public policies adopted between January of 2000 to July of 2019. So this is prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, So our study really serves as a good baseline. And those policies that fell within our scope were those that explicitly aimed to reduce plastic leakage into the environment, those that went above and beyond general waste management policies by calling out plastic specifically. Those that did call out plastic specifically that were general waste management policies did fall within our scope. We mined legal databases such as Ecolex and Infomia to find original policy documents. We also looked through scientific resources like articles from Web of Science and gray literature like United Nations reports in order to find references to policy documents. And lastly, we looked through Google News as well to find references where we could then locate the original policy document, which served as our unit of analysis to determine policy design in the global plastics policy landscape. We added these policies to a free publicly searchable database. We call it the Plastics Policy Inventory, and I'll show you a preview of that later in the talk. And we found 291 total policy documents. We continue to update this, so that number is actually even higher now, but our original study, we found 291. 66 of those were adopted at the international level, and we took the number of policy documents that we were able to locate and compared that to the number of references in the literature where we couldn't actually find the original policy document to calculate this completeness ratio that you see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. At the international level, we had a completeness ratio of 97%, so we consider our sample to be comprehensive at the international level. Though the national level, which you're seeing in the map on your screen here, we found 147 policy documents with a completeness ratio of about 39 to 48%. We consider our sample to be indicative at the national level. And at the subnational level, we only found 77 policy documents, so a completeness ratio of 21%. So this is really a set of examples. So next, we plotted the number of policy documents found over time, and you're looking at national policy documents here. And on the y-axis, we have the number of policies adopted, not cumulative, and x-axis, we have the year. So we're seeing a clear upward trend in the number of policies adopted annually. You're only seeing national, though we're seeing this at every level of government. We are seeing a few key international policies here, and the rise in the national policies appears to coincide with these, beginning with the 2011 Honolulu strategy, then a series of UNEA resolutions. Although this doesn't imply causality, it just suggests an overall trend of increased public policy responses to plastic pollution within the last decade at several levels of government. And at the national level, this upward trend in the overall number of policies adopted largely reflects policies adopted to address plastic bag pollution. So before we dive into this figure, I'm going to give a little bit of background. We analyzed policy design by qualitatively coding the policies in vivo, and we found three main categories of policy instruments: regulatory instruments such as bans, economic instruments like taxes or fees on plastic bags, for example, and information instruments such as education and outreach. So on the y-axis here, you see the policy instruments that fall into those three broad categories, and on the x-axis are the number of national policies using each instrument. And the figure is color-coded by the World Bank regional groups. Regulatory bans, as you can see, were the most common instrument. This is the largest bar here, so very clearly sticks out. And actually, there's every color in our legend tiers here. So bans were actually used in every geographic region analyzed. And national governments were using regulatory bans 3.5 times more frequently than economic instruments and 3 times more frequently than information instruments like education and outreach. So by 2018, nearly half of the global population lived in an area with a bag ban or tax, fee, or levy. So they've become extremely widespread. Next, we compared the policies in the inventory to the top 20 countries producing the greatest amounts of mismanaged plastic waste, according to Dr. Jenna Jambeck and colleagues' 2015 study. We found that the 7 countries that you see here, we were unable to identify a national policy document or a reference to a policy document where we couldn't find the original document for these 7 countries. Another 4 countries, we could only find national policies targeting plastic bags. Note, this doesn't suggest that there's no national policy out there. We were only indicative at the national level, not comprehensive at the national level. And nor does the presence of a policy necessarily mean that a government is effectively managing plastic pollution. So I'm just going to briefly dive into policy effectiveness and some of our study there. So we aim to summarize scientific studies measuring plastic policy effectiveness. We didn't go out and study this on our own. We were summarizing others' work, and that's what you're seeing in this figure here. So on the y-axis, we have the percent reduction in plastic bag consumption after policy adoption. On the x-axis, these are the various geographic jurisdictions that we looked at. And we're focusing on plastic bags here because 82% of the studies that we found focused on policy effectiveness, focused on policies that manage plastic bags specifically. So the vast majority of studies were looking at policies adopted to manage plastic bags. However, we only found studies for about 6 to 8% of the national policies in the inventory. So this is just a small sample of effectiveness that we were able to identify. We also found a time lag between when a scientific study was published and when that policy had been adopted of about 6.5 years. So there may be more studies that are forthcoming that evaluate policy effectiveness in the future. We also aim to summarize recommendations from scientists on how to better manage plastic pollution. I'm not going to go through all of this today, but one example of something that we heard frequently in the scientific literature was to adopt a globally measurable binding target to reduce plastic pollution. And these are some of the other examples, though the full results are in our report. So just to summarize what we're seeing from governments to reduce plastic pollution, we found 291 policies that had a clear aim of reducing plastic pollution. We've collated these in the plastics policy inventory, which I've put a little screenshot and a link here to the inventory that you can check out on your own time, and feel free to email me for the link, or search plastics policy inventory as well. And we have a searchable collated place for these policies. The national policies were often using regulatory bans to target plastic bags, and we're seeing somewhat of a gap where we were unable to identify a lot of the policies for some of the top 20 countries that Dr. Jenna Jambeck and all identified as having the greatest amounts of mismanaged waste. So now that we've covered some of what governments are doing to respond to plastic pollution, I'm going to dive into what businesses are doing, which was also requested in UNEA Resolution 4.6. So the specific businesses that we focused on in this study were those companies thought to have the greatest impact, as determined by analyses outside of our study by the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Circular Economy subset, and the Break Free from Plastic list of top plastic polluters. We also looked at responses by the Global Fortune 300, or the world's largest companies, and those companies participating in voluntary environmental programs. We picked out 3, or VEEPs for short, I'll call them. We picked out 3 specific voluntary environmental programs: the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Commitment, the UN Ocean Conference, and the Our Ocean Conference. Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Commitment, the signatories aim to ensure that 100% of their plastic packaging is reusable, recyclable, or compostable by 2025, whereas UN Ocean Conference and Our Ocean Conference have a commitment registry, so they don't have this specific sort of target like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So first, let's dive into the companies thought to have the greatest impact. We collected their sustainability, corporate social responsibility, integrated reports, or if we couldn't find those, their annual reports. And we text mined them in RStudio published between the years 2015 and 2019, and searched for keywords that were related to plastic pollution, such as plastic waste, plastic recycling, and circular economy. So plastic waste in blue increased from about 7% in 2015 to 24% in 2019. Plastic recycling in purple, which is a little bit hard to see on this figure because of the y-axis, roughly tripled from 2 to 6% over the same time period. And circular economy in green increased from 18% in 2015 to 47% in 2019. And these percentages are the percentage of corporate reports that have this term at least once. So these plastic pollution related issues seem to have increased attention from these companies that are considered to be most influential on the problem. And more so, if you look at the geographic regions, more so for those companies who are headquartered in Europe or China, lesser so for Japan, the United States. And we have another group to just have the same number of countries in the regions per figure that you see here, besides for global, of course. So next, I mentioned some other groups of companies as well. We collected sustainability reports and other reports from the Global Fortune 300, as well as large companies participating in VEEPs. And the Global Fortune 300 does have some overlap with 14 of those companies participating in the voluntary environmental programs. There's the voluntary environmental programs with some Global Fortune 300, and we filtered this to only include those large companies with greater than $10 billion annual revenue. So we collected their sustainability related reports and qualitatively coded them to characterize their action, the plastic type targeted, and articulation strength of commitments, which I'll define later in the talk. We qualitatively coded the most recent report with at least one commitment to reduce plastic pollution, looking back to reports published as early as 2015. So in the results that you'll see further, I broke up the companies into two groups. We have the non-VEEPs, which are the global Fortune 300 minus these 14 that do participate in VEEPs. The other group is just large, greater than $10 billion in annual revenue companies participating in VEEPs. So let's look at what they're doing. First off, the overall trend here is that we're seeing a greater percentage of companies that participate in the voluntary environmental programs using these various actions in their voluntary corporate commitments to manage plastic pollution. So the orange bar is always a bit larger than the blue bar. The overall, besides for waste to energy, which is interesting, where we're seeing those not participating voluntary environmental programs slightly outpacing those in VEEPs for waste to energy. The overall primary actions that we're seeing them taking includes recycling, research and development, as well as education and outreach, which we define as education outreach to both the general public as well as their own employees about the plastic pollution issue. We see less attention on an engagement with the informal waste management sector and less attention on waste to energy. So moving on to the plastic types targeted, we see a great amount of focus on packaging as well as plastics in general, so kind of unspecified plastic, and recycled plastics as well, which lines up well with the recycling actions that we're seeing. We see less attention to recovered marine debris and virgin plastics. So next, I mentioned the articulation strength of the commitments, and I'll define that before we dive into this figure. So looking at a strongly articulated commitment, we define that as commitments that are both time-bound and measurable. So for example, if I aim to produce 75% recycled plastic bottles by 2022, I have both a date that is time-bound and a measurable amount, 75%. If I was medium strength articulation, that would either be measurable or time-bound. So you would either take away the date by 2022 or the measurable amount, 75%. Though, as you can see from the figure, we're often seeing weakly articulated commitments, such as I aim to increase the recyclability of plastic bottles, but I don't give a percentage or a date. So both VEEPs and non-VEEPs are a great percentage of companies have weakly articulated commitments. And one quick point too, in one sustainability report, there's many commitments. So one company can make both a weakly articulated commitment on page 5, then by page 10, making a strongly articulated commitment later. So these numbers do not add up to 100%. So we're seeing a great amount of weakly articulated commitments with VEEPs slightly outpacing non-VEEPs again. And then interestingly, for the strongly articulated commitments, we see 67% of VEEPs are making strongly articulated commitments, while only 17% of those large companies not participating in VEEPs making strong commitments. So in summary, we're seeing that the 3 select VEEPs that we studied in this preliminary report, you see it says preliminary findings at the bottom. This has not been published yet, though looking forward to sharing it soon, that select VEEPs are outpacing those large companies on the global Fortune 300 that are not participating in VEEPs. The primary actions that we're seeing are recycling, research and development, as well as education and outreach. Engagement with the informal waste management sector and waste to energy is much less frequent, though we're seeing a greater percentage of non-VEEPs using waste to energy as compared to those companies participating in VEEPs. The plastic type targeted, we're seeing a lot of attention on packaging, plastics generally, and recycled plastics, and lesser so on recovered marine debris and virgin plastic. And a greater percentage, 67% of those large companies participating in VEEPs are making strong commitments as compared to 17% of the large companies not participating in voluntary environmental programs. So thank you so much, Oceans at Duke, for having me today. And I've included my email, I've included my Twitter handle, so feel free to reach out to me if anyone has any further questions or would like links to anything I've provided today.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that highly informative overview of existing activities and actions by governments and the private sector. So I'd like to introduce our next panelist now, Michelle Nolan. Michelle is faculty at the Duke Law School and is a co-director of the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. She works on a range of matters, including collaborating with community partners on innovative approaches to reduce marine debris. And today she's going to tell us a little bit about that work.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about local government action and provide more of an overview of that possibility for local government action than the deeper dive into policy analysis that Zoe talked about. But in general, I want to acknowledge that when we think about waste reduction and different environmental policies, we're often thinking in terms of national or even international level action. In the United States, we think often about national and state level programs to set policies and maintain permitting authorities for large projects like energy infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, and road construction. And indeed, it's much more efficient to think about it in this way. When you think about the different intervention points along that supply chain and production chain, it makes a lot more sense to stop or reduce the generation of those products and reduce waste generation rather than cleaning it up after the fact. And that's the domain of larger units of government. Megan had mentioned in her talk one of the national level policies, which was banning microbeads from production and being used in cosmetic products. And so that's the type of national level action that we might think about. But for many issues, it's really the local government where implementation takes place. And this is especially so when you're thinking about managing the problems that national and international governments have failed to address. So thinking about waste creation, waste management, and water quality. It's local governments that are operating most of those programs. And so it's appropriate to really focus on what they can do to address this problem.
Hey, Michelle,
So
I'm really sorry to break in. You're in presenter mode, though. You might want to.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is that better? Is that working better?
No, it's
No,
still...
I think you need to swap the display settings again, like we did earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've done. Is that not working here?
Oh.
Oops. Okay, is that better? No. I'll hope that this works. Just wanted to say that in general, there are 3 sources of authority for local governments to think about. There's the state constitution, which will articulate things like the police power for a local government to protect human health and welfare. And those are typically things like your county health department, which will go around and inspect restaurants, for example, to make sure that they're complying with sanitation standards. There's also taxation authority. What is the authority of that local government to impose sales taxes or other fees on different types of activities? You'll have delegation from your state government. In North Carolina, for example, we have the Solid Waste Management Act, which sets general standards for waste management, but delegates most of that authority to the local governments to think about designing programs that are best suited to address that community's needs. And then you have delegation from the federal government. Examples of that are the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, which will articulate minimum standards and then convey explicit authority to units of local government for implementing those different types of controls. So
Michelle,
local government, yes.
I'm sorry, we're not seeing slides, which is fine if we can't get the technology to work, but I just wanted to let you know.
Rats. That's an official
It's fine with
term.
you just talking too. So it's up to you.
Let me, let's see here. Are you seeing anything now?
There we go.
Okay,
Perfect.
excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Sure. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So even with those different sources of authority, though, local governments need to be careful. So one issue that they might want to think about is the degree of autonomy that is granted by the state in general. So is that state, are local governments treated with home rule authority, or are they a Dillon's rule state, which is a much more circumscribed, much more restricted set of authority for local government action? Has there been any type of state level preemption? This slide here that I'm showing from a map program, interactive mapping program created by my colleague, Dr. Nancy Lauer, looks at state and local policies for addressing plastic pollution across the United States. And all of the states here that are highlighted in brown have preempted local government action to address plastic pollution problems. So for purposes of my discussion, though, the rest of my discussion, I'm going to ignore those types of complications and go into areas where the delegation of authority is quite clear. So I'll start with the Clean Water Act. The way the Clean Water Act functions in general, this is a very high level general view, is that water quality standards are articulated for waters of the United States. Waters of the United States are generally thought of as navigable waters and the creeks and streams that feed them. Those water quality standards are designed to accomplish narrative goals, such as making sure that the water quality is good enough to support fishing. It's clean enough for swimming. And in some circumstances, it's clean enough to provide a source of drinking water. So you think about all of the different sources of pollution that might come into those waters. And so that's where the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES water quality permits come into play. Those permits will articulate pollutant concentrations and articulate technology standards that dischargers must comply with before they can discharge their effluent into those waters of the United States. So in terms of an industrial discharge, think about a paper mill, power plants, wastewater treatment plants. And then for municipalities, there are NPDES permits for the stormwater infrastructure. Most cities around the United States collect stormwater to prevent flooding, and that's done to protect property values and eliminate sources of harm within the community. And that water is then collected through underground pipes and discharged straight into streams in many instances. So when you're thinking about stormwater controls, you can have different sources of controls that are required on for different types of entities. So for restaurants, for example, no dumping of grease into the stormwater system. For construction sites, you might have some sort of fencing required to keep sedimentation from running off into the streets. And then, but for the stormwater collection systems themselves, there are also retrofits that can be done to collect trash, siphon it out before that water is discharged into the waters of the United States. Or if you have a very large stormwater system like they do in Baltimore, you might want an in-stream solution like Mr. Trash Wheel, which will siphon off the trash as it flows from the creeks into the Baltimore harbor to keep that harbor clean. But this is always dealing with waste after it has already been produced and it becomes a problem. And so stormwater controls are really your last source of effort, and it works best in conjunction with solid waste management. So with solid waste management laws, I'm going to talk particularly about the North Carolina Solid Waste Management Act. That sets general policies and requirements for how a municipality should run its wastewater, or excuse me, its solid waste system. And then it's up to that local government to enter into contracts for waste collection, for recycling programs, and ultimately for the transportation of waste to a landfill. And then, of course, the contracts for that landfill disposal activity. So those are different intervention points for thinking about what local governments can do. In North Carolina, our Solid Waste Management Act articulates a state policy of waste reduction at the source. So trying to prevent the creation of waste before the local government has to manage it. And so then you can think about all sorts of different interventions. You can adopt a fee or a ban on single-use bags. You could ban polystyrene, require local eateries to use reusable serviceware, or an option for takeout might be to have an opt-in program where the customer has to specifically request that disposable cutlery before the business would give it to them, and different intervention points like that. This is really important for communities to think about because of the actual costs of land disposal. We think of these products as being free for us, but they actually impose great cost on society. For the municipality, there are, of course, the landfill tipping fees, the transportation hauling, street sweeping, storm drain cleaning. For the recycling facilities, there's downtime as they have to remove plastic bags from being entangled within their sorting systems. And there are countless hours devoted to community cleanup efforts around the country. And there are also diminished recycling options. And all of these things that are free to us impose a cost that ultimately comes out of our pockets in terms of taxes that have to go to funding these types of programs at the municipal level. It's also important to think about because of environmental justice considerations. The waste that is produced by all of us, and in particularly our more privileged communities, is typically sent to more vulnerable communities where landfills are located. This is particularly true in Durham, North Carolina, where our waste is sent to the southeast, to Sampson County, one of the more poor counties within our state. And as this diagram shows on the left, or excuse me, on the right, the landfill is located in an area that is predominantly populated by African Americans, Black people, and who are low income. And so all of these externalities are being imported into that community so that we here in Durham don't have to suffer from it. On the production side, there are also environmental justice considerations, thinking about the use of petrochemicals in the refining plants and then those manufacturing facilities, which are also located predominantly in more vulnerable communities. So what I've given is a very high-level overview of the different types of interventions that can be done on a regulatory basis for local communities, but there are also community education and voluntary programs. So executive level actions that local government might take include its purchasing power or procurement policies. They can offer incentive programs like the ones some of my students developed, the SUPER program, the single-use plastic elimination and reduction program to reward businesses that take positive action. And then, of course, local governments can enter into partnerships with local non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, like we've done here in Durham with Bull City Boomerang bags, to provide a free and continual supply of reusable bags for the community. So that concludes my very high-level overview. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Megan.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing your inspiring work with local communities, especially here in North Carolina. And now I will introduce our final panelist of today's webinar, Sarah Balch. Sarah is Principal Associate for Pew's Preventing Ocean Plastic campaign and helped produce Breaking the Plastic Wave, a first of its kind economic model to quantify future projections of plastic pollution and lay out solutions to the issue. Sarah is going to tell us about that work today.
Thank you, Megan, and to the Duke team for inviting Pew to share its work in this webinar. So last year, Pew partnered with Systemic and Forethought Partners to conduct a global modelling analysis of future trajectories of plastic pollution and the impact of different solutions on reducing pollution flows from land to the ocean. I'll be sharing some of the high-level results of this analysis and a few of the promising solutions that we are seeing in this space. So in conducting the global modelling analysis, we asked ourselves three critical questions. First, where are we headed under the current trajectory? Second, what are the solutions that will change this trajectory? And thirdly, what are the costs and benefits to society associated with different technologies and approaches? So where are we headed if we continue as we are? Our results show that under a business as usual scenario, plastic pollution will become unmanageable, with 2 times the plastic waste generation in 2040, 3 times the annual plastic leakage, and 4 times the cumulative amount of plastic waste in the ocean by 2040. This means plastic pollution flows could potentially reach 29 million metric tons per year in 2040. We also mapped out what the current commitments by governments and businesses could achieve. Unfortunately, these only make a 7% difference from the business as usual projections for 2040. We also modelled a number of single solution strategies that focus on one part of the plastics life cycle, and found that strategies focused solely on recycling, for example, or collection and disposal, would significantly increase leakage rates compared to today's levels, or at best keep them at status quo. The only strategy that could bend the plastic pollution curve by 2040 was ambitiously implementing both pre-consumer actions, such as reduction and substitution of plastic use, and post-consumer approaches, including increasing collection and recycling rates. This scenario, termed the system change scenario, demonstrates that we can decrease the amount of plastic pollution going into the ocean in 2040 by 80%. So there is hope in tackling plastic pollution, but what does a system change mean in practice? This scenario comprised 4 broad categories of actions, or 8 separate interventions. The first category is the reduction of plastic use and consumption through elimination of avoidable plastics and establishment of reuse and refill models. Secondly, we modelled the substitution of plastic with alternative materials where appropriate. And the third action category comprised the doubling of recycling rates through better design of products and packaging and investments in collection and recycling infrastructure. Lastly, the fourth category includes the secure disposal of residual waste, for example, reducing illegal dump sites and reducing waste exports. Overall, the system change scenario indicates that by taking measures across the plastic life cycle, we could meet the needs of a growing global population in 2040, with 11% less virgin plastic in the system than today. When we look at the system change scenario, we find that globally it's the most attractive pathway, not only environmentally, but also economically and socially. Governments could save about $70 billion compared to business as usual, while dramatically cutting down plastic pollution rates, reducing projected greenhouse gas emissions, and creating more jobs. But action is needed now. Delaying action by 5 years could increase plastic pollution in the ocean by 80 million metric tons. So I've mentioned the type of actions that will be needed. And to finish up, I wanted to share a few examples of innovative solutions and promising signs of progress. So firstly, in the last year or so, we're seeing some more comprehensive policy responses. As Zoe mentioned, while many countries started efforts to tackle plastic pollution with bans on plastic bags and a few other items, some are now starting to take wider measures, for example, addressing more points in the life cycle, encouraging sustainable alternatives such as reuse, and establishing deposit return schemes and extended producer responsibility in order to increase waste collection and management and incentivise better design. There have also been new commitments from companies. While corporate commitments have typically focused on increasing recyclability, we're now seeing some reduction commitments. For example, in 2019, Unilever committed to a 50% reduction in its virgin plastic packaging. And more recently, PepsiCo, Mondelez International, and Kruger Dr. Pepper have also adopted virgin plastic reduction commitments. There's still a need for much more action by corporates, but these are promising first steps towards reducing plastic usage. And finally, we're seeing new technologies and business models. For example, there are new edible coatings or dissolvable films that could eliminate the use of some plastic packaging. There are improved technologies such as refill stations for beverages and other grocery items. And companies are developing reusable packaging for takeout and e-commerce. And we're also seeing some substitution of plastics with paper-based films and sachets. Many of these initiatives are currently small scale and restricted to certain companies or still at pilot stage. And overall, all stakeholders need to shift from incremental to systemic change to alter the trajectory of plastic pollution. The next 2 years will be pivotal for implementing a first horizon of change, including actions such as eliminating the use of avoidable plastic, curbing expansion of production, and testing refill innovations. And this could then lay the groundwork for further horizons of change to take place in 2025 and 2030. So I'll close here. Thank you for the opportunity to share our work, and I'll turn it back to Megan.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your work and for concluding this webinar with some solutions for solving the plastic pollution problem. So this concludes our panel presentation. Now I'll turn the microphone over to Dr. Doug Novacek of the Duke University Marine Laboratory to facilitate the question and answer segment of the webinar.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to all of our presenters. Great to see we have a couple hundred participants. So thanks to all of you for joining, and again, thanks to the panelists for putting the time in to really put a great program together for us. First thing we'll do is put up a little poll. We just like to keep track of where folks are coming from. Hopefully we're hitting a diverse population of folks. We try to make things as applicable as we can so people can participate. So thanks for doing that. We'll see the results there at the end. So if we could have the panelists come back on with us, and we'll get into some questions. The first one I'll just start. While we do that, Michelle has popped back on. That's great. The first question was about whether Virginia has actually preempted plastic, local plastic ordinances as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. I just replied to that in the Q&A, but I'll go ahead and address it here. I'm not aware that Virginia has adopted any preemption. They have authorized local governments to assess fees for plastic bags, and just a couple of months ago, the governor signed an executive order committing the state government to stop buying single-use plastics, exercising its power of the purse to try to start establishing a solid policy at the state level. But I'm not aware of any preemption of local government action.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, so the next one invokes an interesting idea, which is is there a Montreal protocol for plastics? And everybody's looks at actions and commitments and on producers, any indications that these industries are developing alternative technologies and materials. And I think there was some allusion to it, but just a chance to elaborate on some of those things. So not sure who wants to start, but can we get a Montreal protocol for plastics?
I can dive in a little bit. So regarding what we're seeing, we are seeing that for those companies participating in voluntary environmental programs, a little over 60% were making commitments related to bioplastics. And we use a really loose definition of that. That would just be any plastic that the company specified that was made with alternative bio-based materials like corn, sweet potatoes, beets, whatever. So we are seeing some of that. We're also seeing some commitments related to non-plastic. So that would be potentially substituting glass for plastic and other materials. And that was we saw a little over 30% of companies who participate in voluntary environmental programs using those alternatives to plastic to make plastic related commitments still. And lesser so for those not participating in VEPs. And then we also saw research and development as the second greatest kind of action that we were seeing from the companies that fell within our study. So we're seeing a lot of research and development that may or may not be directed towards exactly what your question was about alternative materials. Some of it definitely was. That could also include things though, like research and development for new recycling technologies or and so on. So it's a little broader in scope, but I do think we are seeing some of that coming up.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on that one, Sarah?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly to add that there are initial discussions at the United Nations Environment Assembly on potential international frameworks for tackling plastic pollution at the global level. And the exact form of those frameworks remains very open, as does whether a negotiating mandate will be agreed. But certainly Montreal Protocol model has come up within those discussions.
Oh, cool. Very cool. Now on a quick personal levels, a question about regards to managing personal plastic use and what are some good ways to initiate reducing your own personal plastic footprint.
I'll chime in with some ideas.
Yeah, great.
For that. So, obviously getting into the habit of doing things like bringing your own water bottle or your own reusable bag is a good thing to do. But if you're ordering takeout, you can also, make a phone call when you're or on the online ordering platform, say that you don't want any of the plastic cutlery or the condiments that are provided. There are also other types of things that people can do. We have a local business here called Green to Go, where they're partnering up with local restaurants to have reusable takeout containers with convenient drop-off locations. And then a group of volunteers actually will come and collect them, sanitize them, and then redistribute them to the different businesses. You can also support local businesses that are springing up to offer refilling stations. Here in Durham, we have one called Fillery that works with, that does soaps and dish soaps, laundry soaps, things like that, personal care products. And we have a new business starting up called something Parcel, I can't remember, but it's anyway a bulk goods production thing. So in any event, there are lots of different things that you can do at the personal level. And yeah, I encourage everybody to do that because that's obviously the easiest. But to make a big impact, you do need this kind of collective action, working with the companies and governments at different levels.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle.
And I'll just chime in. Michelle did a great job answering that, but one great way to start in your own house is to do a trash audit and see what you're throwing away most. It's pretty eye-opening to do that. And then you can tackle that and reduce the things that end up in your trash. Most often it's plastic. So that's a really good place to start as well.
Awesome. So from local to global, the next question is about any recommendations for developing countries to initiate some waste management. There's very little government support in this case in Guatemala. Important rivers that are transporting huge amounts of plastic into the Caribbean and the Pacific. So thoughts on ideas and solutions for the developing world.
Sarah. I can jump in here to kick us off, and then others please chime in.
Super.
I think one policy tool that's increasingly being looked at is referred to as extended producer responsibility. And that's where manufacturers help cover the costs of waste collection and management once a product reaches the end of its use. And that's really a method of ensuring that there's sustainable funding going forward to help finance collection. Establishing collection schemes and waste management is very costly to do, and so it's very important to have these sustainable funding mechanisms in place.
Awesome. We need solutions. Anybody else on that one? Okay. Here's an interesting one about the recycling market. Transfer stations, how can we, it seems like there is a dearth of recycling market, and how the recycling industry could be shorn up or kickstarted or whatever. Anybody?
Yeah, I can jump in there. This is an interesting question, and I think that from my understanding, there's certain types of plastic like PET that can be recycled more efficiently than other types of plastic. So trying to manufacture plastic that doesn't have some of the colorants, some of the additives that make it hard to recycle and make it that lower quality plastic would be a bit of a way to kind of avoid having that issue at the end. Obviously not advocating for producing more plastic just because you might be able to recycle it later. That's not my point. But if your goal is recycling more, then keeping in mind the end of life practices would be my suggestion.
I'd also just chime in briefly. I think that this is one of those topics where markets and financial signals can be very influential. And so you think about imposing fees or taxes on the generation of undesirable products. We've done that with cigarette smoking, for example, to make that more expensive. We have gas taxes. In this country, we have gas taxes that ostensibly go into building more roads, but in other parts of the world, there are gas taxes to really try to boost fuel efficiency and reduce pollution. And so you can use that type of taxation authority to send a very strong economic signal to about the types of products that you value and the types of actions that you want to see companies taking.
Yeah, really good idea. Probably our last question. I think it's a really interesting one. They've all been very good. Thanks all for contributing questions. This is actually about tracking the origin of plastics and specifically what ends up in the ocean. And obviously, yeah. So the question about tracking whether there's chemical signatures or things that can be put in the plastic to actually track where it came from. It's a pretty interesting idea. I don't know who might have some ideas on that one.
I can comment briefly. So Break Free from Plastic, the organization who I cited as having the top plastic polluters report come out, they track not in a chemical way, but they pick up the labels that they see and they document that, and they work with waste pickers worldwide. They have a really large and extensive team. So that's one way of tracking that you can start to figure out, well, what packaging a lot of the times makes it into the environment, and then can we track that back to the companies producing it for, as Sarah mentioned, potentially in the future extended producer responsibility. So that's one way of tracking, and others may know better than I do, but I've heard more there folks actually putting trackers on like plastic bottles, for example, and looking at it circulate in the ocean. I think that was Dr. Rockman's group, maybe Dr. Jambek's group. So those folks have been looking at literally tracking where plastic goes,
right.
A little separate.
No, that's cool. All right, I think we've reached the end of our time together. So thank you again, panelists. Really, I know these things take a lot of effort to put together, and we're delighted to have the insights and thoughts and some hope and some ideas. So on the questions, we'll actually amalgamate them and aggregate them and put them up on the website once they've had a chance to be combed through and answered as much as we can. Here's the poll results. So actually we have quite a lot of folks just interested in coming along, not associated with any particular industry or group. So that's great to see. We've got a lot of folks from government. So we're delighted to have such a great showing and testament to all of you for putting that together and attracting such a great crowd. So thanks again, and I'll turn it over to John Verdon.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks again to all the panelists. It was a fascinating conversation and I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. Thanks to the audience for joining us. And as Doug mentioned, for a lot of the questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, we'll do our best to put answers up on the site. So please do come back and check out the Oceans at Duke website and come back and hear more from the Oceans at Duke network. We're going to join our students and take a pause for the summer, but we are returning with the Future of Our Oceans webinar series in the fall. So hope that you'll look out for that and follow the group on the website in the meantime. So thanks again, everyone.